brings me great pleasure to introduce and kick off our second panel for today, which is going to be moderated by Professor Diane Singerman. Professor Singerman is a professor of political science at the American University in Washington, and she's also a founding partner of, collaborator in Tadamun with one of our other speakers, Karim Ibrahim, who I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to meet and listen to at some other point during our conference. Tadamun is the Cairo Urban Solidarity Initiative. So, Diane.
Thank you all for being here. We have an interesting panel here. I think I'm going to keep my remarks very short. The last panel seemed to include all men. And here we have all women, so that's exciting. Segregation? No. Anyway, it's very good to be here. I'm very glad to be part of this conference and thank the organizers for it. I know all the incredible hard work that everyone has put into it. And I look forward to lots of interesting thoughts. I'm going to keep my remarks, I'm not going to make any remarks, but I reserve the right to talk a little bit after the panelists do. So we will get right to, very happy to have Heba Raouf Ezzat, who you all probably know as a public intellectual, a writer, has taught political theory at Cairo University for a long time, as well as the American University in Cairo, widely published on many different issues, citizenship, women in politics, and she will be speaking today on informality politicized. So thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I thank Omar Nagati and the organizers and everybody who spent a lot of time to make this event come true. And thank you for coming on a Friday. I will speak in English, and I know that the translators will come across some concepts and notions that are a bit weird. So I will try after the concept that I think might not be very common to say it briefly in Arabic. So I hope this will not be disturbing the English speaking audience. I'm talking today about informality politicized, and my passion for this topic, rather than saying that my research and my work in this domain, because it's actually a passion, has grown over years since I was doing my PhD in the 90s and after, working on the concept of citizenship in political theory. And I realized that citizenship cannot be separated from cities, because cities are the manifestation of existential, political, social, economic needs and rights and duties. So I became sort of attracted to the notion of the city, the dimension of space and place, and started understanding that we cannot imagine the spherical without understanding the spatial. So when we talk about the civil society, what sort of a civil society are we talking about? We're talking about a civil society that is working in a specific domain, but that is also either central or peripheral, working on a specific group, working with specific marginalized areas or groups in society. And space became part of my understanding and my imagination of the political. I was very much affected in this journey by the work of many urban writers on urban politics, but I want today to mention especially Nazar al-Sayyad, whom we wanted to have here in this conference, but who couldn't make it because he's too busy, and who's running the Middle East Center at UC Berkeley. And I managed to, across years, or over years, to basically have a dialogue with Dr. Nazar, and in my presentation I will use three concepts that he has been using in his writings. The first one is talking about hybridity, to understand the city and spaces of power. And the second concept would be the fundamentalist city, and it's a concept that he developed with Emergent, one of his PhD students, and they published lately a book titled The Fundamentalist City, how the religious phenomena of fundamentalism actually is an urban phenomena, so that we can understand the cultural religious in its context as urban as well. And the third notion is the notion of the medieval citizenship. He has been trying to explain that when we imagine the city in our modern thinking, we imagine a space of modernization. And we overlook the fact that actually all cities have their own medieval layers and affiliations and loyalties and networks. And these pop up every time the city faces a problem, either to burst into some sort of a presence on the surface, or action that might be pacifist or violent, or taking places and dominating spaces. So this is also very important to remember. When we're talking about Cairo, the first question that I ask myself, which Cairo? We have so many Cairos. And this is also something I addressed in one of my presentations when I talked about the different public spheres of the city and of the country. So is it the Cairo for citizens, or is it the Cairo for Caireans? Because Caireans then develop their own understanding of what citizenship means to them. And here we come in conflict with notions of law, equality, rights, entitlements that are sometimes non-existent, and hence people refer to survival strategies in order to be able to continue their life. Cities are imagined as spaces of equality and spaces of basically nurturing the notion of the modular man, that people will be standardized as citizens, they will enter the city, they become part and parcel of this citizenship relation, and they eventually will leave behind their affiliations and their identities. And the state will try to be as blind as possible, l'état aveugle, that does not really distinguish between different citizens. This was never the case, neither in the West nor in the East. So here comes the notion not of cities for citizens, but of cities that are vehicles of fragmentation and are vehicles of difference, creating difference and fragmenting their own inhabitants. And the notion of citizenship is basically, as Engin Eisen mentioned, is a notion that is imposed by those who manage to rule over the city. So they impose their understanding of citizenship, and the other groups in society actually adhere to that notion. And changes take place, dissent takes place, uprisings take place when groups in society start challenging this notion of citizenship and start challenging these norms that become embedded in day-to-day life and reflect relations of power that are sort of covered and veiled under this notion of citizenship that might take legal or might take nationalist sort of manifestations. Actually, people start redefining their existence, redefining their citizenship, and then reshaping the different spaces and places around them. And I think this is important to understand what happened on Tahrir Square and what happened after. I think it's very important to understand the urban element in the Egyptian revolution and to take the image of Tahrir Square as a very exceptional image, but also as a very humanistic image. When people came to a space, while this space was the icon of a revolution or uprising, depending on how you call it, at the very same time, it was an apolitical space. People were not in a state of conflict within the square itself, which is actually like being in the eye of a tornado. You know, it's like being in the very peaceful space of a very turbulent sort of surrounding. So they, on the square, were dealing with a very humanistic and apolitical, non-conflictual attitude, which they did not definitely manage to keep afterwards. And we are usually faced by this sense of nostalgia, like what about what we did in Tahrir Square? Where did all the love and passion go? Our sense of community, our sense of being Egyptian, nothing more, nothing less, feeling that we are all one and the same. This was a very exceptional moment because you have to locate it in the urban setting and see that this was very out of the course of the urban rationale. Between utopia, that is reflected in this moment of the iconization of Tahrir Square, and the nightmare that many people see, depending on their indicators of lack of security, security vacuum that has been on and off, violent clashes, unrest, life difficulties, economic difficulties, etc. People are trying to understand what has went wrong, while actually it's much easier to try to analyze what is the setting, rather than assuming it went right or wrong. It actually is part of the setting, and it's an urban setting, and we have to understand that. The notion of medieval citizenship actually, and the notion of fundamentalist city, might help us actually understand the rise of religious groups on the political space in Egypt. And I think that they did not they were not absent from the political domain before the revolution, but the presence on the surface like that, I think it came as a surprise to many middle and upper class analysts and social scientists. And actually they were there all the time in the medieval layers of the city, and also in the hybridity and in the fact that cities create needs for politics of identity, and identity is all the time, not only in Cairo or the Arab and Muslim world, but in many other spaces and cosmopolitan cities related to religion. That's why we have all the time this emergence of fundamentalisms rather than just one version of fundamentalism. And here fundamentalism also as a notion need to be opened and stretched, because I think that if we take Nizar Sayyad's definition of the fundamentalist city, he's talking about a city where the minority is denied the right and the access to specific public spaces and public services, where the minority in the city, assuming it's a religious minority, has to abide by the rules set by the majority, where there is gender segregation, and where this situation is actually considered to be legitimate and everybody has to accept it. And if we replace in these assumptions the minority with majority, it will be the Egyptian case. Actually, it's the minority, not in the religious sense, but in the political and in the economic sense, that is imposing where to go and how to divide spaces and places, etc. And it's not religious fundamentalism, it's the fundamentalism of a heritage of authoritarianism and a heritage of distorted capitalism in the country. So my fundamentalist city, when I look at Cairo with the lenses of this notion, is basically the city that Mubarak left behind and that is still run by specific notions of power and order and disorder. And that's why within 2 years' time, even if the faces of the people who are running the country changed, actually the discourse is the same. And sometimes we get surprised, like they are talking the same way Mubarak used to talk. No, they are talking in the tongue of the state. There is a way of the state to thinking like a state. The rationale of the state takes over, and the spaces actually did not differ, and the circumstances and balances of power did not shift. So why should we expect something different without blaming any party? Modernity and creating modern cities is about depersonalization and desacralization. And this was defied by the notion of hybridity, that all the time this has been challenged by the attempt of people to personalize individually or collectively, and also to resacralize what they see as essential for their existence and what would give them meaning in the city. Another very important issue is also the issue of spontaneity. The modern city assumes order, while actually people in their day-to-day life, especially if we bear in mind and take into consideration that the state is not delivering something that David Sims will talk about and wrote about, today and wrote about earlier, how people then resort to creating their own spaces and running their own places, and the flows of power change and the state becomes marginalized rather than the people become marginalized. They simply marginalize the state in their life and go on, starting from sewage to urban informal housing, to parallel education, to anything that you can, transportation and everything, the tuk-tuks and the little tiny tricycles that are all over the place. Flows of power and flows of influence change, and the whole map changes. Where can we then, and how can we then understand that the political has been over many years in Egypt informalized, or the informal politicized. When we will be addressing in this conference many issues regarding informal economics or informal housing or informality generally, this is also a manifestation of relations of power where people have to think of their own spaces and relocate themselves within the wider spaces of the city. If we manage from a political and social sciences perspective to take these concepts that have been offered by basically urban planners and architects and sometimes economists as well and open them to a new redefinition, then I wouldn't be surprised that we can actually use a lot of the literature on street vendors to analyze Salafi movements. Not to offend anybody, because street vendors are seen as having less social esteem, but rather take the rationale, take the core. These are people who have a specific commodity that are working outside the system, that have been deprived of entering the central spaces of the city. And after the fall of the power and the restructuring of space, they have been sweeping all over the city to reclaim space and to reclaim through space identity and citizenship. This is our space and this is also our city. And I think that the mechanisms and the rationale of such marginalized group that has been pushed out of the space can also acquire to the Salafis that many people see as intruders. They are not intruders. They have been kept away. They have been mostly the subject of the severe torture of the state more than anybody else in the political scene before the revolution. And they have been deprived from going into specific spaces. Literally, some social clubs, some areas did not welcome people who were wearing different clothes as orthodox sort of Salafis. And after the revolution, people found them everywhere. People found them in businesses, people found them on the streets, people found them even showing their number when they went into big parades and big demonstrations to say that we are, especially this very well-known Tora Bora Friday, when they came to Tahrir Square and they filled the square and all the area around. There is also that contestation of space and place and notion of citizenship that was very clear when the same groups as Ikhwan and Salafis as well went in front of Cairo University and had this huge multi-million demonstration. The symbolism was very obvious to me. And I said to myself, if Ahmed Lutfi Said and Taha Hussein have been alive, they might have gotten a heart attack. You know, because this is the space where the other notion of being Egyptian, secular, modern education, Cairo University, vis-a-vis Al-Azhar educational system, and vis-a-vis the religious background of education in Egypt 2 centuries ago, was actually iconized. This is Cairo University, this is the statue of Nahdat Masr, this is where Egypt is coming to become modern, and actually I don't think it was conscious when they chose the space because it's huge and you can go to other spaces from it and other squares around like Giza Square, etc. But the notion was very clear to me. This is a contestation not only of space, but also of the symbols of space, of the spaces that are symbols for a specific notion and a specific definition of citizenship, and it is contested. Whether we are with this group or the other, this is none of my concern. My concern is to read the signals that are coming out of contestation of space and place and how the informal that is coming out to become formalized, and I will in a minute talk about the dialectical relation between the formal and the informal that is very ambiguous and very interesting, how it manifests itself in place as well. The graffitis. Before the revolution, we did not know in Egypt the notion of graffitis. And I always wondered when I went to different European cities, oh, we don't have this art. I just told myself, we don't have this art. Maybe because it depends very much on the letters. When you see them in London, for example, using the letters and writing words, for example, and then a bit of drawings here and there, but actually graffiti mushroomed. The youth who were not allowed to go into the spaces of innovation, to go into the spaces of downtown, to go into the spaces of where the area of the symbols of structures of the state are, the parliament, the cabinet, the embassies, including the American embassy, the American university, all these spaces were filled with graffitis of young people who simply felt that they have the right now to use any wall to express themselves. And it's very symbolic, and I think it's very indicative about this contestation and war, urban war, that actually Zygmunt Bauman talked about when he said that there is a destructive, he called it urban wars, and he described it as destructive order and creative chaos. We're not talking about the American foreign policy constructive chaos. We're talking about creativity. We're talking about spontaneity. We're talking about refusing the rationale of the state to impose order. And as long as there are people who manage to build their life by marginalizing the state and taking their own will in their own hand to organize transportation, education, housing, mobility in the city and everything, I think that we will still have this challenge and this dissent growing, actually, and it will not disappear. And I think that the state better thinks about where to place itself and to position itself, because it's not about having a harsh hand and trying to impose order. It will not work. The city is overdominantly majority of areas and neighborhoods that actually are challenging the notion of modern citizenship and are all the time, in every day, embedded in day-to-day details, building their own networks and going back to extended family networks and building their own religious networks, etc. And the notion of order that is based only on the notion of law and a modern fist of the police or of the state will not work. And also, if you see the symbolism of walls, another notion that we can use, for example, is the notion of gated communities. This is an urban notion. This is a notion of not informality, but the contrary, very formal way of taking over land by people who can afford to have gated communities and compounds. And this is the whole area where the new campus of the American University is located, and other planned cities. The urban planners decided to put other people somewhere, and the whole machine of law and legitimizing this process and allowing them to have the land, etc., worked very fine for the favor of the rich and for those who have. Actually, how can we then take again this notion of gated communities, liberate it from the urban dimension of it, and consider it to be actually a political phenomena, and replace class distinction and class affiliation and wealth with political identity? And hence see, and I think that it would explain us far more than the notion of parties when we are analyzing different political groups in Egypt. They are functioning like gated communities rather than functioning like political parties according to the liberal catalogs. Okay, so I think that urban studies and informality have so much to offer us if we take the concepts, see the rationale, change the facade, and use them as analytical tools to understand the political. Occupy, how people started occupying different spaces and places, and also violating law in their own spaces that are legalized. You know that informal housing is not only about taking a space and building a small hut or a frivalla like in Latin America, but also that people on their own land in agricultural and rural areas actually build buildings, which is forbidden by the law because we are short of land to feed the Egyptians. So during the time of the revolution, everybody knows the degree of violation of law, even when people were on Tahrir Square. I mean, people were not just glued in front of the TV dreaming of freedom. People realized that this is a moment of the fall of the state, so you better seize the moment and do something to expand the space of you, either by putting your hand on land owned by the state or by building a couple of more stores on your own building without anybody noticing it, especially in areas where people had to bribe those who come and control with huge amounts of money. So now when they come, there will be nothing to be done. This sense of now the state is ours again, and the hell with laws, we make our own regulations, is actually very indicative of how people are struggling. And this is not to romanticize what happened, and this is not to attack the state for the sake of sounding revolutionary. This is actually to say that we have here political phenomena of power, because sometimes this informality is not romantic at all. This informality entails violence. This informality despises the notion of law, is not willing to negotiate spaces with other groups of different backgrounds. So it's a description and it's not the romanticization. The social scientists camp where I come from, my gated community, have a problem with that, because when you're talking about spontaneity and the fall of rules and the fall of law, you're talking about uncertainty. And you're talking about the incapability of actually predicting what would happen in the future. And also a degree of tension that might lead to violence. I think that in Egypt we have to rethink again how to see ourselves and how to see our urban maps, and to understand that without a public we will not be able to build a republic. But this public doesn't have to look the same. Bottom-up politics is one of the passions of the revolutionaries, but also trying to find this balance between the formal and the informal, and unpack the ambiguity of turning the formal into informal practices, something we are complaining about the performance of the government. Sometimes we have two layers of the formal while the informal networks function in making the decisions, and also how the informal needs to be at a specific point formalized, or at least decide its relation with the formal in order to be able to bring about better life conditions for the majority of the people. I have to stop because Diane wants me to go back to my seat. Thank you very much.